Hello and welcome to my channel Against All Odds. By now, it was already the beginning of December. Every free second I was with my sweetheart. Before going to work and then after finishing work, whenever I had special permission, I was always with Julia at the hospital, right by her side. I always sat on her right side. Did I hold her hand? I told her a lot, stroked her belly a lot. Julia was pregnant. How many times did I sing Peter Fox's House MC in her ear? Yes? Something I insisted on back then. No one was allowed to cry or be negative in Julia's room. Yes, that time was terrible. No question. But crying next to her wasn't going to make things any better. You don't know what Julia is aware of. I don't think she could follow our conversations, but I do think she could feel our presence and she could tell the difference between positive and negative. And crying is negative. And if you can't make sense of that and you're lying in a coma, you might wonder, why is he crying? And then you feel sad too. I didn't want that. I didn't want anyone to cry or be negative in Julia's room. That was very, very, very important to me at the time. Looking back, I also think it was the right decision back then. Yes, Julia had the neck brace. As I said, the glyphos was born. The slightest jolt to Julia's bed could have meant her death. And Julia had a brain probe. You've probably already seen it in the picture. Up here, the little stick, that was the brain probe. Julia's brain was swollen after the accident. This caused intracranial pressure to build up, and she also had a skull base fracture. That's why brain fluid leaked out of her ears. Yes, but the intracranial pressure didn't get any better. At times, it went up over 50. That means the brain expands and eventually it reaches its limits. And of course, our skull cap holds back the swelling. That means if the brain keeps expanding, it can actually crush itself inside the skull. For that reason, it was often considered to open Julia's skull cap so that the brain could expand without damaging itself. But where did the intracranial pressure come from? It didn't get any better. It was always constantly there. Here, Nurse T gathered his courage after consulting with the doctors. Since Julia was on artificial ventilation, it wasn't easy to do an MRI with her. That's why Nurse T took one of those manual resuscitator bags, as I would call it, went into the scanner with Julia and manually ventilated her with this bag. This allowed them to get an image of Julia's brain. And that's where the fistula was discovered. It was this fistula that kept causing the intracranial pressure. What is a fistula? As already mentioned, Julia had suffered brain hemorrhages during or after the accident. It was during these brain hemorrhages that the fistula formed. In other words, a vein found a connection to an artery. That was an unnatural connection. I think in a way it was actually good because it stopped the brain bleeding, but it was still an unnatural connection. And as a result, this intracranial pressure kept developing. This fistula had to be removed. In medical terms, this is called coiling. It has nothing to do with chickens. That means there aren't many doctors in Germany who could or can perform coiling. One doctor was at the University of Frankfurt. Julia was transported from Wiesbaden to Frankfurt by helicopter. There, Julia underwent coiling, meaning a contrast agent was injected into her. Then, using a wire, they went through the groin, past the heart, up the neck, and into the head. And then, with the help of this wire, this connection was plugged. Basically, the lid was put on the bathtub. For observation, Julia stayed 2 more days at the University of Frankfurt, and after that, she was flown back to Wiesbaden. Once Julia arrived in Wiesbaden, the first step was to wean her off artificial ventilation. That means if you are on artificial ventilation for a longer period, the body or the brain forgets how to breathe. So you have to slowly retrain your body to breathe again. In other words, the ventilator is switched on and off at intervals. This process was carried out, and then the medications that had kept Julia in a coma were discontinued. Julia went through withdrawal at that point. She had become physically dependent, and Julia was shaking all over her body like crazy. Those are images you never forget. Of course, we hoped Julia would open her eyes and say, "Here I am." No, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. After Julia came out of the artificial coma, she was unfortunately in a wake coma. That's when it all began. But I'll tell you about that in my next video. Bye.